Hello, everyone. Today I'm with a dear friend of mine, John Evans. I've known John for probably near on 20 years now. John was former head of global security at Rothschild Co, and he and I have spent many a coffee together working through learning from each other and just generally being industry pals, I guess. But we're here today in John's capacity as forming his own business in IT Security Locksmith, and we got talking about DORA. Now, for those who don't know, I'm going to quote this correctly. DORA, EU, Digital Operations Resilience Act, a very important thing coming to FS companies and such in due course. And I have spent some time myself getting my head around DORA, but speaking with John, he has just got such a really good handle on that. And I thought it's time to talk about threat-led pen testing, how that's done, how we look at scopes, and the implications of DORA. So, John, do you just want to give a brief background to DORA, why it's come to be, and why you particularly piqued your interest on it as well?
Hi, Dan. Good to be with you today. In terms of the background to DORA, probably the best place to start is with an initiative from the European Union called their Digital Decade Strategy. This runs until 2030, and really it sort of looks at building a skilled population within the European Union, skilled in terms of digital skills, secure digital infrastructure, digital transformation of businesses, and the digitization of public services. So if you have a look at the European Union website, they've got a big piece on this. It specifies the strategy, it specifies the key performance indicators, and you can have a look at how each individual country in the European Union is performing according to the strategy. If you haven't seen it, it's a great website to have a look at, and it shows you the journey that the European Union is on. If you think of DORA, Digital Operational Resilience Act, it really sort of fits into that digital decade strategy under the secure digital infrastructure piece. Now, there's a whole raft of other security regulations that are coming out. DORA just happens to be one of them. If you look at DORA, it's all about the stability of the union's financial system. It's a regulation, it's not a directive, which means that it gets applied consistently across all member states. And it'll greatly simplify things, especially for companies that, financial services that are working or delivering services to more than one member state in the union. So I think it'll simplify things for them.
That makes absolute sense and quite useful for drawing multiple threads together in stuff that we've talked about separately, but we'll come back to that. Why do you think, John, DORA is required? I know you just touched on the high-level objectives, but from a pragmatic perspective, what's the reason?
Yeah, certainly. So in terms of DORA, I suppose what the European Union are particularly concerned about is this increased reliance within the financial services sector on technology. It's also concerned about the increased interconnectiveness of that technology. And ultimately, I think their main sort of worry, as it were, is around the risk of some sort of cascade where you've got a domino effect where one bank is impacted by some sort of resilience issue, which then consequently impacts more and more financial services, which then undermines the financial markets in the EU. So that's really sort of the main concern of the sort of European regulators. In terms of specifics, I think they're really sort of looking at three main areas. They happen to be ICT disruption, ICT being information communication technology. So ICT disruption, that might be hardware failure, software failure, that sort of thing. They're also concerned about cyber attacks, a cyber incident taking out a critical service or system. And they're also concerned about third-party concentration risk. This is where maybe a critical service for a financial service has been outsourced. And more importantly, for a regulator, they're also concerned, or equally as important, they're also concerned about concentration risk, where multiple financial services firms are using the same third party to provide a critical service. So that could severely impact multiple financial organizations simultaneously.
It's interesting you say this. So at the time of recording, we're just entering February of 24. Very late last night on CNN and then on NPR News was an exact parallel of exactly the same concerns in the US. The SBI issued concerns that this domino and cascading effect against utilities and so on and so forth. So it seems to be a bit of a theme, John, that's coming up. People are starting to turn their attention now to sort of critical services within countries rather than individual entities. Where do you see this, just slightly as a segue out of DORA for a second, where do you see this going? Because I know it's something you've been giving thought to.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to answer that question, Dan. I think that's too big a question to answer.
So, John, in terms of concentration risk, tell me a little bit more about that, because perhaps in this world of outsourcing and where everything is as a service, it's something that isn't necessarily on the mind of people, because they might do their due diligence and that service comes back as adequate. But perhaps no one's thinking the bigger context of many institutions using that same service. What are your thoughts around that?
In terms of concentration risk here, Dan, I think the main challenge European supervisors or regulators have is that a number of these third-party services are not financial services institutions. They may be on the periphery, and as such, they're not subject to the same level of supervision. I think where DORA comes in is very much around one of the pillars of DORA is really around ICT third-party risk management. And as part of the Digital Operational Resilience Act, I would say probably about a quarter of the act relates to the supervision of third parties. Now, what this means is that DORA not only applies to financial services, as we'll discuss later, but it also applies to these third-party service providers to the financial services sector. So that means that obviously these European regulators or regulators, they're going to have more of an important role of overseeing these service providers. So these service providers need to be sort of on message, as it were, that if you are providing services to financial services within the European Union, you are in scope for DORA, and you are going to need to look at how you approach your operational resilience, and you may have to improve the level of resilience that you have in your organizations, because the regulators will be coming in and having a look at how you're approaching it.
That is a serious undertaking for a lot of people. Do you think people are aware that DORA is on its way to people and such?
It's a good question. I would say most probably are aware of it's coming. Certainly the ones that are providing the larger services. In terms of the smaller third-party service providers, it may come as a nasty shock, especially when a regulator starts asking for some regulatory information that they're obliged to provide.
Interesting.
I think it gets a bit more interesting, Dan, when those third-party service providers are outside of the European Union. I'm not sure how the, what's the word I'm looking for, how the penalties apply to them. However, obviously third-party service providers need to comply with DORA if they wish to maintain those working relationships going forward. So in that regard, I think the DORA needs to be complied with by these third-party firms, even if the sanctions or the penalties can't be applied to them directly. If they wish to maintain business, they need to comply.
This brings about the wider concern, doesn't it, of supply chain risk generally and the reliance everyone has on this. I did an interview recently with a law firm, and we were looking at exactly the same parallel in terms of law and where different states, different countries, different groups, if you like, have so many different requirements, and it's such a lattice and crisscross of interdependencies between things. And supply chain is exactly one of these. This is definitely going to have an impact on supply chain. And people forget that with this wonderful ability to say, this is our core business, we don't do X, Y, and Z, that is provided as a service, the overall service is fragmented. It's such a challenge. So take that bit then, John. Who is truly in scope for DORA then? Is it everything that has that core service around it? Where does the Act speak to that? Where does it draw the line?
Yeah, so if you look at the scope of DORA, clearly DORA targets the financial sector. If you look at the Act, there's about 20 different types of firm that are listed. They include things like credit institutions, payment institutions, investment firms, insurance and reinsurance are in scope as well. There's a further 15 different types which are covered there. And then the final one, which is mentioned in the Act, is this requirement for ICT third-party service providers. It's very clear, and it's upfront in the document that they are in scope.
This is a big piece of work.
Yeah, it is a big piece of work, especially when you think about what DORA is in terms of what it covers. So DORA, if I could just briefly cover the 6 pillars.
Please.
If you look at DORA, there are 6 main components that it sort of requires firms to sort of comply with. It covers things like ICT risk management. It covers reporting major ICT related incidents. And when it says about major ICT related incidents, they specify what a major ICT related incident is. That's not up to you to define. They've already defined that for you. Reporting major operational or security payment related incidents. So just to be clear on that, there are operational and security payment incidents which are not caused by ICT related incidents, which are also in scope for DORA, just to make things a little bit more complicated. So it just shows you it's more than just ICT. Well, it's more than just ICT related incidents. There's an operational incident component coming in as well. You've got digital operational resilience testing. You've got information and intelligence sharing. So Dan, we mentioned about ICT third-party risk earlier. One of the pieces of information that you have to share with the regulator is something called a register of information. And a register of information includes a detailed account of all of the third parties that you are contracted to or are contracted to provide you with services. So in terms of that concentration risk that we were talking about, the regulators will use your register of information, combine it with all of the other information they're getting from other financial services firms to identify third-party providers that are providing services to the financial services sector in the European Union. And they'll use that in terms of their oversight and potentially of targeting specific third-party vendors.
Interesting. Now, this is not all new green pasture, is it? So, as you were speaking this through, I was thinking about so many clients that I know that have gone through this, but in another name, in another way, either through their own operational risk management, their own practices, their existing regulations and such. Give me a sense of how much overlap do you think there is here? And is it just another piece of regulation from people when we're pretty much covered? Or from your experience, is there a big delta here, John?
I think that there's a lot that the financial services sector are currently doing in this space. I would say that it's difficult to estimate because it clearly depends on firm by firm, but holistically, I'd probably say that 60, maybe 70% of what's required is being done. You know, obviously, the more sophisticated a firm, the higher that percentage, and the less sophisticated, obviously, the lower. But I think firms, or financial services companies, they need to definitely undertake a gap analysis against what they're currently doing and DORA in order to get a picture of what that delta is. They shouldn't assume that just because they are NIST cyber security conformant or ISO 27001, you know, certified, or even the BCP equivalent of ISO, which is I think it's 22301. You know, these will put you in good stead. They'll be a good basis for you to acquire compliance with DORA. But you've got to remember that DORA is an extensive piece of regulation, and you are going to need to go through it to make sure that you have achieved compliance with it. So I think there's a big piece that needs to be done here, just to demonstrate to your supervisor, you know, your regulatory, your regulators, that you are in conformance with this legislation.
No, this makes a lot of sense. So this is an extension question to that. What do you think the impact is of DORA in this respect? So I asked that in two parts, John. One is impact of work and effort, and secondly, the upside of it. You know, where are the benefits here? Well, what's this going to give us extra to what we're already doing, managing our operational risk, for example?
In terms of impacts, I think you can look at it with different lenses. If you look at it from a management perspective, the Digital Operational Resilience Act clearly articulates a concept called the management body, and it defines what its responsibilities are. Now, this means that the management body or the board is responsible for the implementation of ICT risk management framework. It's responsible for the risks, which means that the ICT risks that are identified are not owned by the CIO or the CISO. They are owned by the management body. So it makes the ICT risks a business issue for management. It clearly sort of defines the responsibilities in terms of policy authorization, roles and responsibilities, approving operational resilience strategy, approving business continuity policy and the ICT business continuity plans. It's responsible for approving the internal audit plans that cover DORA. It's responsible for the budget allocated to operational resilience, and it's responsible for ICT third-party reporting. So that's getting information regarding the ICT third-party risks, the contracts are in place, reviewing the register of information, etc.
Interesting. There's a lot to this. And sort of now more practical stuff. And I just want to segue out of DORA a little bit into something that you and I were discussing, which is very much the sort of looking at threat-based modeling of this, threat-based pen testing to start proving that, the controls are in place correctly. Tell me a little bit around that, John, what you've been thinking, what your interpretation, how this will play out.
Yeah, certainly. So I think if you look at the impacts that DORA is going to have from an operations point of view, I think there's going to be a need for improved process documentation, documentation around your information sources, where they are, where you sort of store that information. It's certainly going to impact new software and services that you procure. So you're going to have new software or services that are required to support this regulation, for example. Yep. You might need to improve your detective, protective, or recovery controls. In terms of this concept of threat-led penetration testing, the Act is very clear in terms of the types of tester that you can hire to do the work for you. They need to be certified. They need to be competent. And the other piece to just mention about threat-led penetration testing is that one of the documents that needs to be drafted and ratified is a technical standard on threat-led penetration testing. And this will specify how firms go about scoping and the methodology used. So some of this definition of what a threat-led penetration testing is or isn't is going to be taken out of the hands of firms, and it's going to be a technical standard that you need to conform with. So that means that the regulators are going to add a degree of consistency about how firms approach threat-led penetration testing.
I am quite excited about that. The sort of nerd in me, having done this for all my working life and 23 years of running businesses in this area, it never ceases to amaze me how little threat-based or threat-led testing that is done. And a very simple example is how many people get an application and then go straight into the OWASP methodology and start executing their playbook. But no one sits there and says, other than understanding, XYZ roles in a particular application, for example, they then just go and apply it. And it's still relatively rare, surprisingly so, that clients sit there and say, we have done a threat model and we want to prove XYZ because this is important to our business. So the pen test becomes that proving of something that is deemed important and specific in risk to them. So I can't see anything but good coming out of this. It's, rather than turning the handle and punching out some compliance, which has greater or lesser virtue depending on your context, it's real and appropriate and applicable for the world perhaps that we are now facing than we should have been. Your thoughts on that, John? You've seen these cycles many a time, haven't you?
Yeah, overall, I think if I look at DORA, I think really it's clearly going to enhance digital resilience of financial services. You're going to have less incidents. You're going to have quicker recovery in the event of an incident. And I think, obviously the European Union is going to be a better and a safer place to do business.
It's interesting, isn't it? Final question for you. Like all these things, there are deadlines, there are a program of events that need to be followed here, but the technical standards haven't followed yet. So there's the deadline and then the guidance. Practically speaking, how do you see that playing out? And this is just a personal opinion.
Yeah, so I think there's some solid dates that are clearly set in stone at this point. So there's the 17th of January 2025 when companies have to be compliant with the regulation. I think there's parts that should have been already done by firms over the last 12 months plus, because they've known this regulation has been coming. In particular, there's clauses that you need to have in your third-party contracts, which you need to be in, obviously that takes time to get built into your contracts with your third parties as they expire. Yeah. So if you've renewed some third-party contracts in the last 12 months and you've failed to get the DORA requirements built into those clauses, I think the regulators are probably going to take a rather dim view of that. You might want to review those and see if you can get those clauses added retrospectively. But I think there's a lot of things that you can be getting on with today. We know what the DORA Act says. So in terms of getting compliance, I think we've got another 11 months to do that. And you should already be doing, your operational resilience testing anyway. So, you need to continue to do that, learn your lessons, because once DORA becomes, on the 17th of January 2025, you are going to have to start reporting some of your incidents to your European regulators. That might then lead to further conversations with them, which would be rather difficult, especially if you haven't got some of these controls in place. So I think that there's a time frame, 11 months, the clock is ticking, and I think firms need to get moving.
So my final question is, John, there's obviously the Act itself, and that's obvious where we get that from, but are there any resources that you are aware of that can help people that break this down and provide more practical guidance?
Yeah, certainly, Dan. So if people want more information on this and how to comply with DORA, please have a look at the IT Security Locksmith website, where I've written a blog on this particular subject.
Well, I've certainly read it, and it's a very, very good intro into it. And then obviously it points out, but gives you that very nice context. But John, as always, very interesting talking with you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for sharing that with us today.
No worries. Thanks for having me, Dan. Cheers.
Thank you.